Sometimes a story doesn't begin with a scream. Sometimes it begins with silence, the kind that rattles your bones harder than any shout ever could. It begins with a black mother, sitting in a cafe she's visited for years, and the moment a racist cop decides she doesn't belong there. It begins with hot coffee pouring down her blouse, with a room frozen in disbelief, with dignity drowning under humiliation, and a world that watched but said nothing. But what that racist cop didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was who she had raised. He didn't know her son would grow up to become the one man capable of tearing open an entire system of silence. He didn't know he had just sparked a reckoning that would shake a police department, ignite a town, and force a nation to confront the violence hidden behind badges. And you are about to witness the entire journey, the pain, the truth, the courage, the transformation, a story that starts with humiliation, but ends with an America choosing justice over fear, unity over silence, love over hate. Before we begin, subscribe to Racist Reality right now. This channel exists so the truth is never buried again. So voices like hers, quiet, gentle, powerful, are heard across the world. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let this story change you in all the ways America still needs changing. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a wake-up call, and it starts now. The coffee, the silence, and the moment that broke Brookdale. The Sunrise Cafe had always been a refuge, a place where mornings felt gentle, where the smell of cinnamon drifted through the air like memory, and where people believed, even briefly, that small-town life still carried kindness in its bones. On Maple Street, right where it met Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, the cafe sat with the kind of humble pride only old buildings possess. The windows, fogged at the edges, glowed amber in the early light, promising warmth to anyone who stepped inside. Every Thursday at 8:10 a.m., without fail, Evelyn Carter pushed open the cafe door, the imperfect doorbell chiming its crooked little jingle. She always moved with a soft grace, slow, steady, unhurried. Not because she was old, though 61 was not young, but because life had taught her the delicate rhythm of endurance. She wore sensible gray sneakers, a lavender cardigan, and a cream-colored blouse with a floral scarf folded neatly over it. The scarf looked like something a woman keeps for decades because it holds a story no one else knows. Evelyn carried a notebook, a faded blue one, with frayed edges, filled with pressed flowers, grocery lists, musings, and the unspoken prayers of a grandmother who had lived through enough to understand the fragile balance between fear and courage in America. 35 years as an elementary school teacher had etched patience into her bones. Widowhood had carved stillness into her voice, but beneath all that gentleness lived a woman who had walked through quieter storms than most people ever saw. She stepped inside, nodded politely to the barista, and moved toward the corner booth by the window. Her booth, the one she had quietly claimed 3 years earlier. And the truth was, everyone in that cafe knew it belonged to her. Not because she fought for it, but because she occupied it with a kind of peace that people respected without needing to be told. She slid into the seat, opened her notebook, and wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic mug the barista had already placed on the table. Black coffee, 1 sugar, no cream, simple, steady, like her. Outside, snow flurries drifted in slow spirals across the street. Inside, forks clinked softly, conversations murmured, and Kiara Brooks, a 16-year-old girl with bright eyes and a head full of dreams, sat near the pastry counter eating a blueberry muffin while scrolling through her phone. Kiara wasn't looking for trouble. She wasn't trying to be anyone's hero. She was just waiting for her bus. And then the door opened again. The bell didn't just ring, it snapped. Officer Greg Walker stepped inside like a man who believed the world owed him something. He was tall, broad-shouldered, white, 35, with a swagger that suggested he owned whatever space he walked into. People said he had a commanding presence, but really it was just entitlement sharpened into habit. His uniform was crisp, his jaw was tight, his eyes scan, evaluating, claiming. The cafe quieted when he entered. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Walker strode past the counter, past Kiara, past the tables, straight to Evelyn's booth. The heavy sound of his boots against the polished wood floor felt like an intrusion, like something sacred had been stepped on. Evelyn looked up slowly, her fingers still resting lightly on her notebook. Walker gave her a smile, not warm, not polite, a smile that felt like a test. "You mind moving, ma'am?" he asked. His tone made it clear it wasn't a question. Evelyn blinked once. "Excuse me. I sit here on Thursdays." He pointed at the booth as if labeling property. "This is my spot." There were at least 5 empty tables in the cafe. Evelyn glanced at them, then back at Walker. "I've been sitting here every Thursday for 3 years, she said softly. Her voice wasn't confrontational, just factual, gentle, steady. But facts don't matter to men who think ownership is their birthright. Walker's smile tightened. "Ma'am, I'm asking nicely. Let's not make this difficult." The barista froze mid-motion, holding a pitcher of steamed milk. A couple at a nearby table lowered their voices. Even the cafe's old radio humming, faint gospel seemed to go quiet. Kiara, sensing tension, raised her phone discreetly. She didn't start recording yet, but her camera hovered. "Ready." Evelyn didn't move. She didn't shrink. She didn't apologize. She simply folded her hands in her lap. "I'm comfortable here," she said. "You're welcome to—" Walker didn't let her finish. He reached across the table, picked up her mug of steaming coffee, and with slow, deliberate cruelty, turned it upside down onto her chest. The coffee hit her blouse with a hiss. Hot liquid soaked through the fabric, trickling downward, spreading across her cream-colored shirt like a blooming stain. Evelyn inhaled sharply, not from the burn, though it hurt, but from the humiliation. People always imagine that humiliation makes noise, that someone screams, or yells, or cries. But sometimes humiliation is silent, so silent it feels suffocating. No one moved, no one shouted, no one stopped him. The barista's hands trembled, a spoon clattered onto a plate. Kiara whispered, "Oh my God," and pressed the record. Evelyn didn't wipe the stain. She didn't flinch. She didn't look down at her ruined blouse. She slowly lifted her eyes to Walker's face. She didn't look angry. She didn't look scared. She looked familiar, recognizing something she'd seen before. Not him, but his type. The type who believed authority gave them ownership. The type who thought quiet black women were safe targets. The type who'd been allowed to get away with this for far too long. Walker smirked. "What are you going to do?" he taunted. "Call your son?" Evelyn's lips parted in the smallest, saddest smile. A smile that held 61 years of endurance inside it. The kind of smile a woman gives when life has shown her, again and again, that dignity costs more than most people can afford. "I won't need to," she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It was soft, steady, gentle. Yet it carried more weight than Walker's badge ever had. Evelyn stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her soaked blouse with trembling fingers. She set her napkin on the table, folded neatly, and took a breath as if gathering not courage but composure. Composure she should never have had to muster in the first place. Kiara followed her movement with her phone, capturing every second. And through her lens, something unexpected came into view. The community bulletin board near the door. On it hung a framed photograph of Brookdale's new police chief, Chief David Carter, smiling in uniform. Beneath the photo, written in firm, proud lettering, "Proudly raised by Evelyn Carter." A hush fell over the cafe, not the silence of helplessness this time, but the silence of realization. Walker's smirk faltered. A couple gasped. Someone whispered, "Oh my God, that's his mother." Kiara zoomed in, catching Walker's widening eyes, the panic beginning to tug at his face. Evelyn didn't look back. She didn't need to. She walked out of the Sunrise Cafe with her blouse stained, her dignity bruised, but her spirit unbroken. Her silence didn't mean defeat. It meant something else. The storm had already begun. Because in the next hour, Kiara's 38-second video would hit social media. In 3 hours, it would go viral. By noon, the nation would know her name. A quiet black woman humiliated in front of a town that pretended to be gentle. A police officer whose arrogance finally exposed him. A son, her son, who carried a badge, a duty, and now a wound deeper than anyone could see. This wasn't just coffee. This wasn't just a spilled drink. This wasn't just a bad cop or a bad day. This was America, and America was watching. Because racism doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it pours, sometimes it burns quietly against the skin of a woman who has spent her whole life trying to believe in a better tomorrow. But this time, tomorrow will be different. This time, her silence was the spark, and the world was about to catch fire. The viral wave and a sun's fury beneath stillness. The video did not explode all at once. It trembled first, like a spark catching on dry leaves, before it roared through the country in a firestorm of disbelief and outrage. At 9:32 a.m., Kiara Brooks uploaded her 38-second clip with a simple caption, "This just happened at Sunrise Cafe in Brookdale. Her name is Evelyn. No hashtags, no demands, just truth." Within an hour, the truth had become a mirror, reflecting everything America pretended not to see. At 10:05 a.m., it hit Twitter. At 10:37, it landed on Facebook. By 11:03 a.m., millions had watched the slow-motion cruelty of a man in uniform tilting a cup of steaming coffee onto an older black woman who did nothing but occupy space he believed he deserved. The comments flooded in. "Again, I'm sick to my stomach. Why is this still happening? This is my grandmother. This is all of our grandmothers." Then someone zoomed in on the bulletin board behind Evelyn, on the framed photo of Chief David Carter, and someone wrote, "She's the police chief's mother." The internet inhaled sharply and exhaled in fury. The hashtag #WashACoffeeCop started trending, then mutated into Tire Evelyn Carter, and soon became something larger, a symbol, a shorthand for every moment of everyday violence that was too small to be prosecuted, but too cruel to forget. Brookdale Police Department's social media pages were drowned in comments, questions, demands, denunciations, calls for accountability. But the department for once said nothing, and its silence spoke for itself. Emails piled up, voicemails choked inboxes, reporters circled like hawks. And somewhere across town, in a building lined with award plaques and polished floors, Chief David Carter sat in a weekly strategy meeting. He didn't know yet, not until the door flew open. One of his aides rushed in, face pale, phone shaking in her hand. "Chief, you need to see this." He took the phone without a word, pressed play, and the world tilted. He saw his mother, his quiet, gentle mother, sitting in her Thursday booth. He saw her blouse, her hands folded neatly, her eyes lowered in peace. He saw Officer Greg Walker towering over her. He saw the mug lift. He saw the pour. He heard Kiara's breathless, horrified whisper. He watched his mother stand, dignity dripping off her like the coffee staining her shirt. He watched her walk out alone. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. He didn't reply. Once was enough. Once was too much. David set the phone down very gently, almost reverently, as if placing something sacred that had been defiled. The room was silent, all eyes locked on him, waiting for an explosion. But Chief David Carter did not explode. He did not raise his voice. He did not curse, shout, or punch the wall. Anger lived in him differently. It lived under the skin, slow, controlled, lethal. The kind of anger men learn when the world has punished them for expressing it. He simply stood. Meeting adjourned. Those who had worked with him long enough recognized the tremble beneath the calm, the storm beneath the discipline. He walked out of the room, each step a vow. By the time he reached the station, the parking lot was already swarming with news vans. Reporters leaned out of windows with microphones. A few locals stood holding coffee cups in silent solidarity. The beginnings of a community awakening, forming without instruction. David walked past all of them. Inside, the hallways went quiet as he passed. Officers stiffened, conversations halted. Some looked away, shame in their eyes. Others avoided eye contact out of fear. Fear of what he might do, fear of what this meant, fear of truth. He didn't stop until he reached the briefing room. "Bring me Officer Walker," he told the nearest sergeant. His voice was so level it was terrifying. Greg Walker entered a few minutes later, chewing gum, looking irritated, unaware, or pretending to be unaware, of the storm he had triggered. "Something about a form I missed?" he said with an exaggerated sigh. David didn't respond. He didn't look up. He simply said, "Sit." The word hit the room like a gavel. Walker sat. David slid a printed still from the video across the table. It showed Evelyn's face, soaked in coffee, eyes steady, dignity ringing louder than any scream could have. "You poured coffee on a woman this morning," David said. Walker shrugged. "Sir, I didn't know." "That she was my mother?" David interrupted, still calm, still deadly. "No, you didn't know. But that's not the problem." Walker blinked. "The problem," David continued, "is that you didn't think she mattered." He let the words sit in the air like ash. "You thought she was just another older, black woman in your way." A statement, not a question. Walker opened his mouth searching for something, an excuse, a lie, a justification, but David raised a hand. "She didn't raise her voice," he said softly. "She didn't curse you. She didn't fight back." He tapped the still image again. "But the world heard her anyway." A long silence. Then David exhaled, sharp but controlled. "You are relieved of duty effective immediately. Internal Affairs will contact you." Walker's mouth fell open. "You're firing me?" "No," David said. "Not yet," which was somehow worse. "Administrative leave pending investigation." Walker stood abruptly, the chair screeching backward. "Chief, leave." One word, final. Walker stormed out, face flushed with anger and humiliation. But for David, this moment was not victory. It was agony. Because he knew what came next would not simply be about a cup of spilled coffee. It would not be about one bad officer. It would not be about a single moment of cruelty. This would become a mirror, a reckoning, a national question with no gentle answer. And he also knew that his mother, his quiet, patient, flower-pressing mother, was right now sitting in her home, alone, wearing a blouse that still carried the memory of hot coffee and cold silence. He needed to go to her. But duty called first. The world had already begun to burn. By 1 p.m., the video had been shared across the country. By 2 a.m., civil rights groups were issuing statements. By 3 Ornash, activists organized a 4 p.m. gathering at the precinct. Show up, speak up, stand with Evelyn. Cars honked in passing protest. Social media lit up with dueling narratives, supporters of justice and defenders of the badge. The town of Brookdale found itself becoming a stage for America's oldest wound. Inside the station, the tension was suffocating. Some officers stood taller as David passed, their expressions heavy with apology and courage. Others glared, their loyalty shaken, their egos bruised. And David felt every glance, every whisper, every fear. He stepped into his office and closed the door. His badge gleamed faintly under the harsher fluorescent light. He touched it lightly, remembering everything that badge was supposed to represent: protection, duty, integrity, courage, not cruelty, not entitlement, not silence. He picked up his phone to call his mother, but his hand shook slightly, a tremor he couldn't hide from himself. How could he comfort her when he was fighting tears of his own? Before he could dial, a notification lit up his screen. Nar Evelyn Carter now trending #1 nationwide. He closed his eyes. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. This was about every black woman who had swallowed humiliation to survive. Every quiet victim. Every small violation dismissed as no big deal. Every moment of casual cruelty that never made the news. And now, finally, one of those moments had been caught on camera. A reckoning had arrived, one that had been 70 years in the making. And David Carter would meet it, not as a son, not as a chief, but as a man who understood that silence can be violence and justice cannot wait for permission. He stood, straightened his shoulders, and stepped out of his office. A storm was outside. A storm was inside. But he walked toward it anyway. The town that stood still and the system that shook awake. The morning after the video went viral, Brookdale felt different. Not louder, not angrier, but heavier, as though the air itself carried the weight of what the town had witnessed. Something had fractured in its quiet surface. Something long hidden had finally pushed its way into the light. By 8:09 a.m., a small line formed outside the Brookdale Police Department. Not protesters yet, not activists or organizers, just everyday people. A retired librarian, a teenage boy in a Letterman jacket, a mother with her toddler in a stroller, the pastor from New Hope Baptist Church, a mechanic still in grease-stained sleeves, and almost all of them held coffee cups, not raised in anger, not hurled in outrage, just held, quiet, deliberate, symbolic, a message without volume. We saw what you did to her. We're not looking away, not this time. Some held their cups like candles. Others held them like shields. But all stood silently, creating a presence heavier than any chant could have been. Inside the building, Chief David Carter stepped into the hallway and paused just long enough to see them through the glass doors. His chest tightened, not with pride, but with a strange, fragile ache. These people were not here for him. They were here for the truth, for Evelyn, for every person who had been dismissed, minimized, ignored. It gave him strength, but it also added weight, because standing with the people meant standing against the system, and he knew that would cost him. He headed toward the conference room, where his senior officers waited with stiff expressions and crossed arms. "We're going to cooperate fully with internal affairs," he said. "No exceptions." Some officers nodded, some glared, some shifted uncomfortably. Lieutenant Sarah Cole spoke first, her voice steady. "You want an internal review?" "Wider," David said. "I'm opening an audit." A few officers looked at him sharply. "Of what?" someone asked. "Everything," he replied. 10 years of use of force incidents, civilian complaints, unresolved files, anything labeled "no further action." A murmur rippled through the room. One of the older sergeants leaned forward. "Chief, with respect, that's a can of worms. We don't need to." "That can should never have been sealed," David said. "We don't get to pretend the rod isn't there just because we didn't open the drawer." Silence. Thick, uneasy, necessary. A younger officer, Reynolds, biracial, earnest, loyal, nodded subtly. It was enough to remind David he wasn't alone. But not everyone was on his side. Rumors had already begun spreading. "Chief's making this personal. He's tearing down morale. He's out to get white officers. He's bowing to politics. He's listening to social media more than his own men." And now, as David looked around the table, he could see which officers believed those rumors. He could see the fear, the resentment, the unwillingness to face what needed to be faced. Still, he pressed on. "I expect full cooperation," he said. "Anyone who interferes, even subtly, will be placed on immediate suspension." That landed hard. A few officers looked at each other, exchanging silent rebellions. David held their gaze unblinking. "We either fix this," he said, "or someone else will fix it for us." The meeting broke, and the hallways buzzed with whispers. Whispers that said change was coming, and not everyone wanted it. Across town, Evelyn's silence. While Brookdale's police department braced for examination, Evelyn Carter sat on her living room couch in the same lavender cardigan she'd worn the morning before. The coffee stain had been washed from her blouse, but the memory of that hot liquid, the way it clung to her skin, the way the cafe fell into suffocating silence, lingered like smoke after a fire. Her hands rested in her lap, still enfolded, as though holding on to something fragile. Her breath was shallow, her eyes unfocused. She hadn't answered the phone. She hadn't turned on the television. She hadn't eaten breakfast. Her world had shrunk to a living room bathed in quiet morning light. A knock sounded at her door. It took her several moments to look up. The door opened gently. Mrs. Jenkins, her next-door neighbor of nearly 20 years, stepped inside carrying a pot of chamomile tea. Her white curls were tucked behind her ears, and her expression was soft, but lined with sorrow. "I heard," Mrs. Jenkins whispered, sitting beside her. "Everyone's heard." Evelyn nodded faintly, but her eyes did not move. Mrs. Jenkins took her hand, warm and trembling. "I came to see how you were doing." Another nod, no words. The older woman hesitated, then looked into Evelyn's eyes, searching for something. Recognition, grief, anger, anything. "Do you remember," she began gently, "the summer after the march on Selma? When little David was still learning to walk, Evelyn blinked, slowly, once. "I do," she whispered. "I remember something you said back then," Mrs. Jenkins continued. "You looked at him, you held him in your lap, and you said, 'One day he's going to walk through fire.'" A tear finally escaped Evelyn's right eye, carving a quiet path down her cheek. "And now," Mrs. Jenkins said softly, "he is." Evelyn didn't wipe the tears. She let it fall. Mrs. Jenkins squeezed her hand, grounding her. "You raised a man who doesn't run from the flames." The words were meant as comfort, but to Evelyn, they felt like a reminder of the cost. At the station, a new piece of truth. Back at the police department, the building hummed with tension. The phone on David's desk buzzed. Emails, calls, media inquiries, statements. He ignored almost all of them. His attention was on the first stack of files Sarah Cole handed him. "You'll want to see this," she said. These were Walker's past records, complaints, warnings, memos. A slim folder for a man who had spent over a decade creating problems. Too slim. "What's missing?" David murmured. "Everything," Sarah replied. "This man wasn't clean. This folder is." Before he could respond, his email pinged with a subject line that froze the room for a moment. "Coffee Cop's History." No body text, just attachments. 3 civilian complaints, 2 internal memos marked no further action, 1 never filed report by a former trainee describing Walker screaming at an elderly Latino man and falsifying the citation. David's jaw clenched so hard the muscle twitched. Someone had tried to bury it, but someone else wanted the truth out. "Reopen everything," he ordered, handing Sarah the documents. "Start with these and flag Walker's file." Then he did something unexpected, something that spoke not just to the chief, but to the son inside him. He printed the still frame from the video, his mother's face soaked in coffee, her expression silent but dignified, and he said quietly, "This won't happen again. Not in his department, not in his town, not on his watch." The first public reckoning. By 4:01 p.m., a crowd had gathered outside the station. Teachers, students, elders, parents, store clerks, pastors, activists. Some held handwritten signs. "Stand with Evelyn, stop protecting abusers." "Truth matters, Black women deserve safety too," but many held coffee cups, still hot, still full, a reminder of what had happened and what they refused to forget. Inside, officers peered out through the blinds, stunned by the growing movement. Some scoffed. Some whispered, "This has gone too far." Others watched with quiet, aching agreement. David stepped outside at 4:15 p.m. and faced the cameras, not with a statement drafted by the mayor's office, not with prepared remarks, but with the raw clarity of a man who understood what this moment meant. "My name is David Carter," he began. "I serve this town as police chief, and I was raised by the woman in that video." A hush fell over the crowd. She didn't ask for attention. She didn't raise her voice. But what was done to her was a disgrace, not just to her, not just to me, but to this community. His voice did not shake, but the hand he curled at his side trembled. "This is bigger than one officer," he said. "It's bigger than one act of cruelty. This is about what we allow, what we overlook, and what we excuse." He looked into the camera, eyes fierce and unwavering. "I will not allow this department to become a place where cruelty hides behind a badge." Flash bulbs snapped. Reporters raised microphones. But David stepped back, refusing questions. Some stories needed silence. Some truths needed space to land. And this one was only beginning. Humanistic lesson. Woven in. That evening, as the sun set behind Brookdale, the quiet crowd outside the station stood unmoving, holding their coffee like candles. Their presence whispered a lesson that America too often forgets. You don't need to shout to change the world. You just need to refuse to look away. Change begins when ordinary people decide humiliation is no longer invisible. When dignity becomes a community project. When one woman's pain becomes everyone's responsibility. Brookdale had been shaken awake, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't roll over and go back to sleep. The archives, the rot, and the first 7 names, The next morning, before dawn had fully claimed the sky, Chief David Carter unlocked the side door of the Brookdale Police Department and walked into a silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt watchful. The building groaned faintly as if adjusting to the pressure of the moment, the fluorescent lights flickering awake in jittery pulses. He didn't go to his office. He didn't check emails. He didn't call the mayor. He didn't speak to anyone. Instead, he walked to the stairwell that led to the basement, where the archives lived. A place most officers never visited. A place where stories went to die. The metal door hissed as he pushed it open, and a wave of stale air washed over him. Dust, old paper, something metallic, and something else entirely. Neglect. Neglect has a smell, a texture, a temperature. It lingers where truth has been shelved too long. The room was dimly lit, pale sunlight leaking timidly through barred windows. File cabinets stretched along the walls like gray tombstones, labeled in fading marker, dented, rusted, forgotten. He ran his fingers across one of the cabinets. Dust clung to his skin, thick, undisturbed. How many years had these drawers sat unopened? How many voices were trapped inside? "This is where it lives," he whispered to himself. "The truth. Buried." He pulled open the first drawer. It resisted at first, groaning like something waking from a long, forced sleep. When it finally slid out, papers shifted inside, slumped, bent, warped by humidity, abandoned. Inside were manila folders. Each folder has a life, a complaint, a plea, a story that no one wanted to confront. The weight of it settled on him. He took out the first folder, then another, skimming the pages, feeling anger gather in his bloodstream like rising heat. He saw dates from 2015, 2013, 2019, complaints about harassment, excessive force, improper searches, racial slurs muttered under breath, unrecorded but remembered by victims. Many files ended with the same phrase stamped in red: "No further action." David clenched his jaw so tightly it ached. That phrase, those 3 words, were where the system lied to itself, where it pretended something wasn't happening simply because it didn't want to deal with the consequences if it admitted it. He pushed deeper into the archives, cabinet after cabinet, drawer after drawer, file after file, and everywhere the same quiet rot, not dramatic, not headline-grabbing, not wicked enough to trigger lawsuits, just subtle enough to be ignored, again and again, until it became normal. Systemic injustice did not begin with brutality. It began with paperwork. Internal Affairs sets up camp. By 9:01 a.m., the basement was buzzing, not with chaos but with purpose. Internal Affairs rolled in portable scanners, laptops, stacks of highlighters, labeled bins, sticky notes. The team looked at the mountain of documents and exchanged grim glances. Officer Janine Moore approached David with a clipboard, almost bending under its own weight. "We're looking at over 200 unresolved complaints," she said. "A third of them never went past intake." David inhaled slowly, then exhaled with steel in his breath. "Start sorting by officer," he instructed. "Anything with a pattern goes to the top." "We're going to need more hands," she said. "We'll get them." Within 2 hours, 23 cases were flagged. 7 involved the same 2 officers. 3 were signed off by supervisors who happened to be the accused officer's close friends. One file contained a complaint from a mother whose teenage son had been shoved during a stop and frisk. All charges dropped, but the bruises remained. Her complaint was signed off by a supervisor who now sat on the town's advisory board for public safety. Everything was connected. Everything had been protected. Everything was catching up now. The department cracks. By midday, the shift in Brookdale Police Department was no longer metaphorical. It was physical. 2 officers turned in their resignation letters without explanation. 4 requested early retirement. 2 called in sick. One sergeant stormed down the hallway muttering, "Witch hunt, soft leadership. This town's losing its mind." But David didn't flinch. He didn't soften. He didn't waver. "This isn't a witch hunt," he said loudly enough for the room to hear. "It's a truth hunt, and the truth's been ignored long enough." Some officers looked away. Some looked angry. But a few, just a few, looked relieved. Officer Reynolds approached him quietly in the hallway. "You know they're going to fight this," he said. I know, David replied, but you're still doing it. David looked him in the eyes. Especially because of that. Reynolds nodded, a small flicker of loyalty in his gaze. Meanwhile, Evelyn meets the girl who filmed everything across town. Evelyn Carter sat in her living room, staring out the window at nothing and everything. The world outside moved in quiet pieces, cars passing, wind stirring, neighbors shoveling driveways. But inside her, time felt stuck. She wore a lavender dress now, freshly ironed. Her hair was pinned softly. Her face, though calm, looked distant, somewhere between memory and numbness. The doorbell rang. Mrs. Jenkins opened it cautiously, then stepped aside. A young girl entered, clutching a small bouquet of daisies, fresh, white, trembling slightly in her nervous hands. "My name is Kiara," she said softly. "Kiara Brooks. I'm the one who filmed—" What happened? Evelyn looked at her for a long moment, studying her face, her eyes, the way her hands shook around the delicate flowers. Then she patted the seat beside her. Kiara sat, twisting the stems between her fingers. Her voice cracked. "I didn't mean for it to go viral. I wasn't trying to be famous. I couldn't not do something." Evelyn's lips softened into something between a smile and a sigh. "You did something brave," she said quietly. "You gave the truth a witness." Tears filled Kiara's eyes. "You changed everything." Evelyn didn't reply with words. She simply reached over and squeezed Kiara's hand, soft, steady, maternal. Sometimes healing begins not with an apology, but with recognition. A surprising ally appears. That evening, David received a phone call, a voice he hadn't expected to hear. "Chief Carter? This is Sergeant Frank Miller, retired." Frank Miller, the man who had worn the uniform for 32 years, a man known for his blunt honesty, old-school style, and a certain hardness that made younger officers both respect and fear him. "What can I do for you, Sergeant?" David asked. "We need to talk." They met at the old diner on Maple Street. Frank was already in a booth, stirring a cup of black coffee. He looked older than David remembered. The weight of years etched deeply into his eyes. "You're digging up bones, son," Frank said. "I know. And some of those bones belong to men people still call heroes." David nodded. "I know." Frank looked down, ashamed. "I was there when some of those files were closed without review. I didn't fight hard enough. And for that, I'm sorry." He pulled a folded envelope from his jacket and slid it across the table. "Names, incidents, my notes, use them." David picked it up. "Thank you." Frank stood, joints stiff. "You're going to make enemies, son. Powerful ones. Ones that smile in public and scheme in private." David met his gaze. "Then they can watch me clean up their mess." Frank half smiled. "Attaboy." The first 7 names. Back at the precinct, David sat with Lieutenant Sarah Cole in a cramped office, a mountain of files surrounding them. They cross-referenced Frank's notes with the archived complaints. Patterns emerged, lines connected, truths crystallized. 7 names surfaced like bruises beneath the skin. Officers with repeated excessive force complaints. Sonard officers who falsified reports. Officers with histories of racially biased conduct. Officers shielded by friends in high ranks. Officers whose abuses had been buried in paperwork and silence. Sarah looked exhausted as she flipped through the final file. "All 7?" she asked wearily. David nodded. "Every last one. You know some of them are close with the union rep." "I'm not here to protect relationships," he said. "I'm here to protect the public." Sarah straightened. "Then I'll draft the suspension notices." And she did, one by one, name by name, case by case. While she typed, David looked at the stack of files, not as paper, but as people, as stories, as harm that had been allowed to spread like mold in the walls. It wasn't just 7 officers. It was everyone who had protected them, everyone who had stayed silent, everyone who had said it's not that bad. But now the truth was awake, and it wasn't going back to sleep. A lesson rising from the rot. As David left the archives that night, he paused at the top of the stairs. Behind him, the basement glowed with harsh white light, illuminating the dust and files and untold stories. He realized something then, something painful, something necessary. Evil doesn't grow in darkness alone. It grows in places where good men look away. And so he made himself a promise. Brookdale would look away no longer. Not while he was chief, not while his mother's dignity still echoed in his chest, not while the truth begged for daylight. Humanistic moral thread. This wasn't just a departmental audit. It wasn't just a procedure. It wasn't just justice for Evelyn. It was a reminder that America is not broken because of the wicked. It is broken because of the comfort, because of the quiet, because of the ones who file complaints away and call it order. But just as rot grows in silence, healing grows in truth. And now, finally, the truth has been unleashed. The list, the backlash, and the eighth name no one saw coming by sunrise, Brookdale felt like it was breathing unevenly, half hope, half fear. The tension was no longer invisible. It pulsed through the streets, threaded through conversations, slipped beneath doors and into living rooms. The town was no longer simply watching the story unfold. It was inside it. Chief David Carter arrived at the police headquarters before anyone else. His footsteps echoed through the quiet lobby, steady but heavy, as if each step weighed a little more than the one before. In his hands he carried a thin manila folder, not much thicker than a few sheets of paper, but weight has never been measured in inches. This file carried the future of the department inside it. At 6:45 a.m., he walked out the front door, past the flagpole, past the empty parking lot, to the public bulletin board beside the precinct entrance. He pinned the sheet of paper to the board. It fluttered slightly in the morning breeze, almost shy, almost afraid. But the words printed on it were not afraid at all. Officers under formal review. Brookdale Police Department. Below the header were 7 names, 7 badge numbers, 7 descriptions of internal cases now reopened. 7 sins that could no longer hide in silence. Underneath, handwritten in David's unmistakable script, no justice without truth, no trust without transparency. He stepped back. The board was no longer a board. It was a line drawn in the sand. By 7:02 a.m., the first civilian approached, an older woman walking her dog. She paused, lifted her glasses, read the names and whispered, "Finally." By 7:11 a.m., someone took a photo of the list and posted it online. By 7:30 a.m., the post had over 12,000 shares, and Brookdale was officially on fire. Inside the department, thunder before the storm. When the first officers arrived for morning shift, they stopped in their tracks as soon as they saw the list. Some froze, some whispered, some cursed under their breath. A few looked genuinely shaken. Lieutenant Sarah Cole arrived moments later, walking briskly, her eyes sharp and alert. "Chief," she said the second she stepped inside, "the media's already outside." He nodded. "Good." "Some officers are threatening to walk out," she warned. David gave no sign of fear. "Let them." Cole exhaled through her nose. Not frustration, respect. "I've got your back," she said quietly, "but you need to know. This just became national." He nodded again. He had known this moment was coming. The truth always spills beyond its borders. By 9 a.m., the station lobby overflowed with reporters, microphones, cameras, protesters holding coffee cups like symbols of remembrance and resistance. Everyone wanted David to make a statement. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't hide either. At 9:03 a.m., he stepped into the lobby. His posture was calm, almost still, as though he were standing not in front of chaos, but in front of a mirror reflecting everything America had ignored. "Yes," he said, before anyone could ask a question. "I authorized the list." Flashes burst. Cameras clicked like frantic heartbeats. "No," he continued, "I am not sorry." A murmur rushed through the room, surprised, impressed, threatened. "And if protecting the people of Brookdale cost me favor with those who abuse their badge?" He leaned slightly toward the microphones. "Well, then so be it." A reporter shouted, "Chief Carter, don't you think this undermines officer morale?" David paused, not uncertain, but intentional. "Morale built on silence isn't morale," he said. "It's complicity." Another voice cut in. "Is this political?" He shook his head. "It's personal," he said, "because I live here, and I believe in this department, but I believe in justice more." It was the kind of statement that made some people stand a little taller and made others start dialing lawyers. The first resignation and the contagion of fear. At 11:17 a.m., Sergeant Victor Manley, 12 years on the force, respected by some, feared by others, walked into the lobby, badge in hand. He didn't look ashamed. He looked angry. He pushed past reporters and said into a waiting microphone, "I didn't sign up to be crucified for paperwork. This isn't policing, it's politics." Someone booed, someone cheered, someone cursed. Manley set his badge down loudly on the front desk, turned, and walked out the door. David watched through his office window, face expressionless, but something inside him cracked, not regret, not fear, but the realization that truth always demands sacrifice. And sometimes the first thing sacrificed is comfort. The Union's counterattack. At 2:45 p.m., a courier delivered a certified envelope to the front desk. Sarah Cole brought it to David. "It's from the police union," she said grimly. He opened it slowly. The letter was written in cold, weaponized professionalism, accusing him of creating a hostile work environment, alleging that he targeted officers without just cause, claiming he was bending to political pressure, showed a warning of an impending no-confidence vote. Cole's jaw tightened. "They want you to retract the list." David folded the letter in half, placed it on the table, and said, "Let them vote." Outside, the crowd had doubled. People held signs now. "Truth matters. No more hiding. Cops should be accountable to protect black women." And then something happened that no one expected. A woman stepped forward, about 60, wearing a worn brown coat. She carried no sign, just a photograph. "My son filed a complaint against one of those officers 3 years ago," she said, voice trembling. "It disappeared." She lifted her photo higher. "Today, I saw his name on that list. Thank you, Chief Carter." David stepped out to meet her. They didn't hug. They didn't shake hands. But the moment between them felt sacred. Two people recognizing the same wound, the same hunger for truth. Inside the department, fractures become fault lines. By late afternoon, the atmosphere inside Brookdale PD was suffocating. A captain muttered curses under his breath, not caring who heard. A rookie refused to partner with anyone whose name appeared on the list. Radio calls were delayed. Reports piled up unsigned. Some officers moved with sharp defensive hostility. Others moved with quiet hope. And then came the break. One of the listed officers, Dale Horton, knocked on David's door. David looked up, expecting defiance. Instead, Horton's shoulders sagged. His eyes were weary. "Chief," he swallowed. "Can we talk?" David gestured for him to sit. Horton didn't. He stood staring at the desk as if ashamed to look David in the eyes. "I was reckless," he said. "I thought nobody was watching, but they were, and I deserved to be called out." David studied him, searching for sincerity. "Why now?" he asked. Horton looked up, eyes raw. "Because maybe this department finally has a shot at being what it pretends to be." David nodded slowly. "Then help us get there." Horton nodded once, resolute. "I will." For the first time that day, David felt the faintest glimmer of hope. But it didn't last long. Evelyn speaks to a city that needed to hear her. That evening, the local news station aired an interview with Evelyn Carter. She sat in her living room, hands folded in her lap, her voice soft but steady. "My son is not perfect," she said, "but what he's doing, it matters, because the only thing worse than injustice is pretending it doesn't exist." She did not cry. She did not shake. She did not raise her voice. But by the time the video ended, it wasn't the anchor who fell silent. It was the viewers. Across town, people watched with wet eyes and clenched fists. Teachers, parents, activists, teenagers, elders. Evelyn had not asked to become a symbol, but sometimes dignity has a way of choosing you. Backlash, threats, and the darkness before a new dawn. The backlash arrived quickly. Anonymous threats, harsh voicemails, property vandalized, social media campaigns painting David as a traitor. But for every cruel message, 5 more poured in offering support. This is what real leadership looks like. "I don't trust the police, but I trust him." This is how change starts. And late that night, as David sat alone in his office, an envelope slid under his door. It was thin, too light to matter, But truth is rarely heavy at first. Inside was a report from 2017. Subordinate remain. A missing audio file. Fun award. A name not on the original list. And a handwritten note. You missed one. David felt a coldness settle into his bones. Not fear, not surprise, but understanding. Because exposing rot always reveals more rot. He picked up the paper, his hand trembling. The name written at the top, Corporal Daniel Creel, and the truth contained in that forgotten file was about to change everything. Lesson thread. Truth is not a light switch. It is a fuse. Once lit, it burns through every lie, every cover-up, every quiet cruelty. And sometimes truth doesn't set you free at first. Sometimes it brings fire. But America cannot heal if it refuses to burn away what destroys it. Brookdale had begun that painful, necessary burning, and the eighth name was only the beginning. The eighth name and the girl who never forgot the envelope was thin, almost weightless, but David felt the weight anyway. He sat alone in his dimly lit office, the rest of the building quiet, the hum of the old ventilation system the only sound cutting through the stillness. Outside his window, the streetlights cast long shadows across the parking lot, stretching like the truth trying to reach him. The handwriting on the envelope was sharp, hurried, unmistakably male. David had seen that handwriting before, on duty logs, old training forms, corner margins of disciplinary reports. He opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a name, a badge number, 3 dates. Corporal Daniel Creel, 3 incidents spanning 5 years, 3 civilian complaints, 3 cases quietly dismissed, and stamped across each one, in red ink, resolved internally, no further action. David's stomach tightened. He spread the papers across his desk. They told a familiar story, one of patterns, silence, protection, but he needed more than paperwork. He needed proof. In the archives, he searched for Creel's files. Nothing. Not in the active cases. Not in disciplinary logs. Not in the miscellaneous drawer where inconvenient stories often went to die. But when he checked archived shift schedules, there it was. Creel on duty for every incident, Creel the only officer at each scene. And then, buried deep in a box labeled K-Series 2015-2020, hidden beneath radio logs and faded Polaroid photos, David found a disc, a CDR, labeled in smudged marker, traffic stop 11/02/2017, Officer Creel. He inserted it into the department's oldest working computer, the only one with a disk drive. The video loaded without audio. A black sedan pulled over on a rural road. The timestamp flickered, 11:41 p.m. A flashlight beam hit the windshield. Creel approached the driver's side window with a posture too aggressive for a simple stop. The driver, a young black man, early 20s, rolled the window halfway. His hands were visible. His posture is calm. No sound played, but the gestures were unmistakable. Creel barking orders. The driver complied. A tension that grew too quickly. Creel yanked the door open, pulled the young man out, and slammed him against the car. No resistance, no hesitation, no justification. The passenger door cracked open. A teenage girl stepped out, small, frightened, hands raised high. Her face was frozen mid-breath, eyes wide, pleading, terrified. Creel spun toward her, shouting. He reached up, and then the video cut to static. The dash cam had been turned off. A single frame froze on the screen. The girl's face, young, black, scared, silent. David closed the program and sat back, his breath unsteady. He knew that face. Brookdale knew it too once. This wasn't just a name. This was a wound. He made a call. The confrontation. By 9 a.m., Corporal Daniel Creel sat in the internal review room. He didn't appear confused or nervous. He didn't even ask why he had been called in. Guilt sometimes hides behind confidence. David stood across from him, Sarah Cole at his side. The room felt colder than usual. "You recognize this date?" David asked, sliding a printed incident summary across the table. Creel shrugged. "Been a while." "You were the only officer on the scene," David said. "It was a minor traffic violation." "Nothing big," Creel replied. David leaned forward. The footage tells a different story. A muscle in Creel's jaw twitched. You turned off your dash cam, Sarah said. Care to explain that? It malfunctioned, Creel said quickly. I checked the maintenance log, Sarah replied. No reports of malfunction before or after that night. Creel's posture stiffened. Effective immediately, David said. You are suspended pending investigation. The case is being reopened and referred to the state. Harry. Creel stood abruptly, knocking over the chair. You're making a mistake. David didn't blink. No, he said. I'm correcting one. The 8th name hits the board. By noon, a new sheet of paper appeared on the department bulletin board. One name, one badge number, one statement. Corporal Daniel Creel, suspended pending investigation. And underneath, in David's handwriting, no justice without accountability. The reaction was immediate. Officers whispered in the hallways. Union reps circled the station like vultures. Reporters gathered outside. The town buzzed with new energy. Part outrage, part vindication, part fear. The 8th name was different. It wasn't just another officer. It was a story many had tried to forget, a wound that had never truly healed. And that night, the past returned in human form. The Community Forum, a truth that finally spoke. Brookdale's community center overflowed with people. Teachers, parents, students, activists, elders. Folding chairs filled the room. Others stood against walls. The air buzzed with anticipation and unresolved ghosts. David stood at the front, preparing to address questions about the 8th name. But someone stood first. A young woman with a stillness to her, like someone who had waited years to speak. My name is Jasmine Carter, she said. Soft gasps whispered across the room. People recognized her. They remembered her. They just didn't know they remembered her. She lifted a printed image, a still from the dash cam video. It was her face frozen at age 15. Terrified, small, alone. I was in the car Creel pulled over, she said. The room fell silent. My brother was driving. He didn't argue. He didn't fight. He didn't raise his voice. But Creel slammed him down anyway. He was bruised for a week, couldn't eat without pain. Her voice trembled but did not break. The report said he was combative, she continued. But he wasn't. We told the truth. No one believed us. Her eyes locked onto David's. Until now. No applause followed, no cheers, just tears, quiet and trembling, slipping down the faces of people who finally understood why the 8th name mattered. A truth ignored becomes a wound. A truth spoken becomes a reckoning. Later that night, a porch swing and a mother's wisdom. After the forum, David drove to his mother's house. The night was cool, the kind that whispers clarity into tired bones. Evelyn sat on the porch swing, knitting gently, the rhythmic motion steadying her breath. The porch light cast warm shadows across her face. David sat beside her. For a moment, they didn't speak. The creak of the swing filled the silence. I remember Jasmine, Evelyn said softly. Used to sell lemonade by the church. David looked down. She placed her hand on his. Truth takes time, baby, she murmured. But don't forget. Her words landed like a blessing and a burden. The fight was not over, but the truth was on his side now. The new rule and the whisper of hope. The next morning, David announced a sweeping internal policy. All use of force incidents must be reviewed by a civilian board within 30 days. No delay, no burying, no silence. He printed the policy, laminated it, and taped it to the wall beside Creel's name. A woman reading it whispered, "About time." And then she smiled. Just a small smile, but hope often starts small. The lesson woven through the pain. What happened to Jasmine wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a bad day. It wasn't a single officer failing his duty. It was a symptom of a system that forgets the humanity it swore to protect. But truth, once spoken, once revealed, has a way of spreading. It inspires others to step into the light. It reminds communities they deserve better. It shows young people like Jasmine that silence is not the final chapter. And that is the lesson at the heart of Part 6. Justice cannot heal the past, but it can prevent the future from repeating it. The political firestorm in the state that came knocking. The storm didn't break, It thickened. Rain fell for days, cold and relentless, washing over Brookdale like a cleansing ritual the town hadn't asked for. Water pooled along curb edges, ran in shimmering lines down windows, soaked through the police station roof in slow, steady drops. But nothing washed away the tension. If anything, the rain made the world quieter, sharpening every whisper of conflict. Chief David Carter walked through it without an umbrella, as if he embraced the sting of the cold. As if pain, at this point, was familiar enough to be a companion. When he arrived at the police station, soaked through, he found the building humming, not with productivity, but with unrest. Officers worked with a tense efficiency or sluggish defiance, depending on which side of the line they stood. Inside, the lights flickered, a sign something fragile was straining. Today was the state inquiry, a panel of state officials, clipboards in hand, expressions carved from granite, had arrived to evaluate David's leadership, his decisions, and, more importantly, the truth he'd dragged screaming into daylight. This wasn't a meeting, this was judgment. The inquiry room, the conference room was unusually cold, as though someone had deliberately lowered the thermostat to make people uncomfortable. Papers rustled, pens clicked. Every sound echoed with clinical precision. The state board members, 5 of them, sat behind tables arranged in a half circle. They didn't look at David with hostility, only with the detached curiosity of people who evaluate damage for a living. David took a seat across from them, posture straight, eyes calm. Sarah Cole and Officer Janine Moore sat on either side of him, steady anchors in a rising tide. A board member cleared her throat. "Chief Carter," she began, "we have several concerns." She listed them, each accusation falling like a stone. Bypassing internal review procedures, suspending officers without preliminary hearings, Shui acting on anonymous complaints, Shorty publicly posting personnel actions, allowing community pressure to influence internal decisions. At each point, she paused as if expecting him to break. He didn't. When they asked, "Why bypass internal review?" he answered, "Because what's internal is often invisible." "Why suspend officers without hearings?" "Because suspension isn't punishment, it's prevention." "Why trust anonymous complaints?" "Anonymity doesn't mean untruth." They scribbled. He remained still. Every answer cost him something. Calm, composure, blood pressure, but he didn't let it show. The testimonials that mattered then, Sarah spoke. Not trembling, not defensive. Her voice was unwavering. "Chief Carter acted because our department ignored red flags for years. He acted because silence had become policy. He acted because someone had to." Then Janine Moore added her testimony. She referenced data points, timelines, ignored complaints, her own experience watching legitimate concerns get dismissed without review. She spoke with a clarity that left no oxygen for excuses. But the moment that shifted the room came when Jasmine Carter's mother stepped forward. A board member said, "Ma'am, this inquiry concerns the chief's conduct, not—" "No," she raised her hand, "it concerns the truth." She stood before them not as a witness, not as an activist, but as a mother who had carried trauma for years. "My daughter was 15, she said through a trembling breath. "She spoke up once, and the department shut her down." The room hushed. Pens stopped mid-scratch. "But Chief Carter listened," she continued, "not as an officer, as a human being." Her voice broke, but she kept speaking, each word carved from pain. "Maybe if someone like him had listened sooner, my children wouldn't carry fear every time they pass a patrol car." Silence blanketed the room. Not polite silence. Not procedural silence. The kind of silence that comes when truth finally forces people to reckon with themselves. The board members shifted, scribbled slower, looked at each other with unspoken questions. There are moments when rhetoric ends and humanity begins. This was one of them. Aftermath. A man alone. After the board adjourned, they left without fanfare. No verdict, no reassurances, no comfort, just procedure, just politics, just power. David sat alone in his office afterward, shoulders heavy, suit soaked from the rain, hair damp against his forehead. The building outside was restless, officers murmuring, phones ringing, the storm tapping hard against the windows. He looked at the photos on his wall. His wife, his daughter, a candlelight vigil for the 8 names that had come before Creel. A picture of Evelyn, smiling gently, soft, unbreakable. He touched the edge of her photo. He thought of the coffee streaking down her blouse, the way her hands trembled later when she spoke to him, the weight she carried in silence, the dignity with which she refused to bow. And for the first time in days, he allowed himself to feel tired. Not defeated, not scared, just profoundly, deeply tired. Was he the man he hoped to be when he pinned on this badge? Was he enough to fix a system that had been cracked long before he arrived? Was he doing the right thing? Or was he a stone thrown into an ocean too deep for one man to disturb? He didn't know, but he knew he was trying. And maybe that mattered more than the result. 2 weeks later, the verdict. The report arrived in an unremarkable manila envelope, delivered by an intern who didn't seem to know its significance. David read it once, then again. No charges, no disciplinary action, no condemnation, but no praise either, just a single line. Chief Carter's actions, while unorthodox, adhered to the ethical framework of necessary reform. Not vindication, not victory, but permission to continue. Sometimes survival is its own form of triumph. He didn't frame the letter. He didn't celebrate. He simply set it aside and got back to work. When cities begin to wake up, Brookdale changed. Not explosively, not dramatically, not overnight. Change rarely announces itself with fireworks. It creeps, it whispers. It grows quietly in the cracks left behind by truth. A new intake officer arrived, younger, gentler. A mural was painted downtown, 8 silhouettes in shades of blue and gold with the words, "We see you, we hear you, we remember." Jasmine's op-ed was printed in the local paper. She wrote, "Justice didn't knock on our door. It walked in, angry and wet from the rain, and dared us to listen." Children left flowers near the mural. Teachers discussed accountability in classrooms. Local businesses posted signs supporting reform. Brookdale was waking up, and unlike before, it didn't roll over and go back to sleep. A daughter's question. The rain cleared one Sunday morning, sunlight shyly reclaiming the sky. David sat on his porch drinking coffee, warm steam rising into cool air. His daughter climbed onto the porch swing beside him, hugging her knees. "Daddy," she asked. "Yes, sweetheart? Did you win?" He paused. He could have lied. He could have said, "Yes," and given her the comfort she deserved. But she was growing up in a world where truth mattered. So he said, "No." Her small eyebrows furrowed. "Then why are you smiling?" He took a breath. "Because," he said, "I didn't let them win either." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Are you going back tomorrow?" "Yes." "Even if they still don't like you?" He smiled softly. "Especially then." Sometimes courage is not loud. Sometimes courage is simply returning the next day. The note that wouldn't let them forget. That night, long after his daughter fell asleep, David wrote a final message. Not for the board, not for the mayor, not for the press. For the people of Brookdale. For every person who had ever been dismissed, ignored, silenced, humiliated. He taped the note inside the precinct's front lobby, right next to the security camera. So officers, visitors, reporters, and citizens would all see it every time they entered. It read, "To every citizen who has ever felt unseen, I see you. To every voice that was ever silenced, I hear you. And to every badge that has forgotten what it stands for, I remember." He stepped back. The note was small, the message was enormous, and the truth could never be ignored again. The students' question that echoed across America. The next morning, the town hall opened for a scheduled school field trip. Dozens of students filed in, wide-eyed, curious. One girl, no older than 10, raised her hand shyly. "Chief Carter?" she asked. "Yes?" "Why did that officer pour coffee on your mom?" The room froze. David knelt beside her so he met her eyes. "Because sometimes," he said gently, "people forget the weight of their actions." She tilted her head. "Did she get justice?" He paused. He thought of Evelyn's trembling hands, her quiet dignity, her silence piercing louder than any scream. "She got a voice," he said, And sometimes that's even more powerful. Moral thread of part 7. Justice is not always a verdict. Sometimes justice is a conversation the world can no longer avoid. Sometimes justice is a city waking up. Sometimes justice is a little girl asking why. Sometimes justice is a mother speaking truth into a microphone. Sometimes justice is a man refusing to stop fighting even when he's battered by resistance. And sometimes justice is simply choosing love and courage over silence and comfort. The reckoning that became a beginning. Brookdale was no longer the same town. Something fundamental had shifted, quietly, then loudly, then permanently. The people had changed. The department had changed. Even the morning air carried a different weight, as if every breath belonged not only to the present, but to generations who had waited for this unveiling of truth. And yet the storm had not fully passed. Whispers spread through neighborhoods, through church aisles, through barber shops and diners. Opinions collided like weather fronts, some clashing, some merging, some dissolving into uncomfortable silence. The truth was not softening Brookdale. I was refining it. Sometimes the refining burns, sometimes it purifies, and sometimes it opens a door no one thought would ever budge. The state inquiry report isn't the end, it's the threshold. When the state report was quietly delivered 2 weeks later, its simplicity startled everyone who read it. Chief Carter's actions, while unorthodox, adhered to the ethical framework of necessary reform. No condemnation, no reprimand, no praise, just validation wrapped in neutrality, official acknowledgement that what he had done was ethical, justified, and necessary. The silence of the statement said more than any applause could. Systems rarely admit their guilt in bold letters, but this was the closest thing to an apology Brookdale had ever seen from the state. David didn't celebrate. He didn't even smile. He simply placed the letter inside a drawer, closed it gently, and whispered, "Now we keep going." Because this was never about winning. It was about transforming. The town that woke up slow, but woke up for good. It began with small things. A new intake officer, young, eager, compassionate, greeted citizens with a softness the department hadn't seen in years. A mural appeared downtown. Painted in strokes of gold, deep blue, and red clay, it showed 9 silhouettes, the 8 known victims of internal silence, and the anonymous 9th still emerging. Beneath it were the words, "We see you, we hear you, we remember." Evelyn visited it once, placing her palm against one of the silhouettes, not sure which one represented her pain, because her pain didn't belong to one silhouette. It belonged to the entire mural. Jasmine wrote an op-ed in the local newspaper. It was printed in full on page 1, titled, "Truth doesn't arrive with permission, it arrives because it must." People read it over breakfast, and over lunch, and at red lights while their children fidgeted in the back seat. She wrote, "Justice didn't knock on our door. It walked in soaked from the rain and dared us to finally listen." Brookdale didn't erupt after that. It breathed, deeply, painfully, newly. Transformation often sounds like breathing after being underwater for too long. Inside the department, a culture of silence begins to crack. Some officers still resisted the reforms. Their resentment became a physical presence, sharp glances, stiff motions, clipped words. A few clung to old habits with the desperation of people watching their world change without their permission. But others, the ones who had stayed silent out of fear or confusion, slowly began to stand straighter. Officer Reynolds, once uncertain, now walked the halls with a newfound steadiness. Officer Moore became a force of consistency, her reports immaculate, her professionalism unwavering. And Lieutenant Cole became David's shield, strategist, and partner in rebuilding a department that had long forgotten its purpose. The whispers changed too. Some whispered fear, some whispered admiration, but they whispered the truth now. Because when one man chooses courage, it forces everyone else to decide whether they'll keep hiding or step into the light. A town hall full of children and the question that echoed across America. Brookdale Elementary sent its 4th graders on a civic engagement field trip to Town Hall. Their laughter filled the lobby like sunlight. Their questions came with the innocence of people who had not yet inherited generational wounds. One girl, small and gentle, lifted her hand shyly. Her voice trembled with sincerity as she asked, "Chief Carter, why did that police officer pour coffee on your mom?" The adult stiffened. The room paused. Pain rippled along the walls. David knelt so he could meet her at eye level. He considered lying. He considered softening the truth. But children deserve the truth more than anyone, because they are the ones who will decide what kind of America the next generation inherits. Because sometimes people forget the weight of their actions, he said softly, and they treat other people like they don't matter. She swallowed. Did she get justice? David stared into her eyes. Deep, honest, unafraid. She got a voice, he said, and sometimes that can be even more powerful. The girl nodded slowly, as if her young heart had absorbed a lesson she would carry for years. And in that moment, Brookdale took another step toward healing. Because justice isn't always a verdict. Sometimes justice is a child understanding compassion, one question at a time. The night David finally let himself rest. That evening, long after town hall emptied, long after the lights were turned off and silence reclaimed the rooms, David sat alone in his office. The window reflected the remnants of sunset, purple smeared into orange, orange fading into twilight. He pulled out the handwritten note he had taped earlier to the front entrance. To every citizen who has ever felt unseen, I see you. To every voice that was silenced, I hear you. And to every badge that forgot what it stands for, I remember. He touched the edges, then let his hand fall. The note was no longer a message. It was a promise. A promise he intended to honor until the day he took his badge off for the last time. Evelyn's quiet strength and the love that never left at home. Evelyn Carter sat in her small armchair, knitting needles clicking faintly. Her hands had healed from the scalding coffee. Her blouse had long been washed, but the memory remained, etched into her dignity like a shadow stitched into sunlight. When David arrived home, she smiled at him with that gentle knowing only mothers possess. "You look tired," she said. "I am. But you're still standing," she whispered. He sat at her feet like a boy again, resting his head against her knees. "Did I do the right thing, Mom?" he asked, voice barely above a breath. Her hand stroked his hair slowly. "You did what good men do," she said. "You told the truth, even when it cost you something." He closed his eyes. "And that," she murmured, "is why this country still has a chance." Her words filled him with warmth, not the kind that heals instantly, but the kind that keeps a person walking even when the road is steep and the world is heavy. Brookdale's new morning weeks passed. Brookdale slowly transformed. A civilian oversight board was established, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a real force. Officers attended de-escalation training led by community advocates and mental health professionals. Transparency reports were made public. Every use of force incident underwent mandatory external review. People began walking into the station without fear. Students visited on field trips without silent dread. Elders passed by and nodded, not out of politeness, but out of trust that had been rebuilt one honest step at a time. Brookdale wasn't perfect. Brookdale wasn't healed. But Brookdale was awake. And awakening in this country is a form of revolution. The moral reckoning, what America must learn. The story didn't end with the 8th name, or the 9th, or the 10th that would eventually come. Because injustice doesn't disappear in a single season. Bias doesn't vanish after one reckoning. Systems don't transform because of one press conference or one protest. But America becomes stronger every time people decide to act with courage instead of silence. And that is the moral arc of this story. Racism doesn't end with punishment. Racism ends with responsibility, with empathy, with accountability, with love that refuses to stay quiet. Brookdale began to heal when a teenager dared to record the truth. A mother refused to let humiliation define her. A community stood together in silent protest. An officer confronted his own failures. The chief chose integrity over popularity. A young girl asked a question the whole country needed to hear. Justice is not delivered by one hero. Justice is built by many hearts choosing kindness over indifference. America grows stronger when its people stand strong, together, not apart. The ending, that is really a beginning. The final scene belongs to the people of Brookdale. A spring morning. the mural glowing under the new sun, children walking past with backpacks swinging. Evelyn stood quietly in front of the painted silhouettes, one hand resting on her heart. David watched from a distance, not as a chief, not as a hero, but as a son. He walks toward her. She smiles. "You did good," she whispers. "So did you." Above them, the morning light spreads across the mural like a blessing, and for the first time since the coffee spilled across Evelyn's blouse, Brookdale feels whole. This is not the end of racist injustice. This is not the end of heartbreak. This is not the end of America's unfinished struggle, but it is proof that silence can be broken. Wounds can be acknowledged. The community can rise. And love, even quiet love, can begin a revolution. This is the lesson. Never choose silence. Never choose cruelty. Never choose division. Choose kindness. Choose courage. Choose love that heals. Choose to stand with your neighbors, not above them, not against them, because a stronger America is not built by policies. It is built by people. People like you, people like Evelyn, people like David, people like Jasmine, people who refuse to stop believing in justice. At the heart of this story, beneath the pain, beneath the outrage, beneath every headline and every trembling voice, lies a truth we cannot ignore. America becomes stronger every time ordinary people choose love over cruelty, courage over silence, and unity over fear. A cup of spilled coffee became a spark. A quiet mother's dignity became a mirror. A son's determination became a force of change. And a community's awakening became a reminder that justice does not grow by accident. It grows because people decide to fight for one another. We may not all wear badges. We may not all hold titles. We may not all stand at podiums when the world is watching. But every single one of us, every neighbor, every parent, every student, every stranger, has the power to choose humanity, to choose empathy, to choose to protect one another instead of staying silent. That is how we build a better America. Not through fear, not through division, but through connection, through compassion, through an unwavering commitment to say, "I see you, I hear you, and I will stand beside you." If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes, if it reminded you of the America we can still become, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to the Racist Reality channel right now. Join a community that refuses to look away, a community that believes in justice, humanity, and stories powerful enough to change the world. After you subscribe, visit the channel and watch more stories. Stories that challenge, stories that uplift, stories that help us grow stronger together. Because silence protects injustice, but stories build a better nation. And together, with love, courage, and truth, we will keep building, one story at a time.